let's look with Skall and Todd at some later period industrial era swords, what they think about them from the view of a maker and a user. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm here of course with Todd at Todd's Place, kindly hosting, and Skall, special guest visiting over from Canada at the moment. Now,
how could we resist?
Yeah, absolutely. What a great opportunity to get together. So I brought some antique swords down today to look at and talk about and stimulate some discussion. Now, there is a part 1 to this video. This is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1 already, check that out. That was a deep dive look at a couple of rapiers and a small sword. But what we're now going to look at are some later period swords that come out of, well, specifically come out of the small sword and then out of the cut and thrust swords of earlier periods as well. So, to start off, we have got, do you guys know what this is?
Spadroon.
Yay!
I didn't.
It's the holy Spadroon of Antioch here. Right, so this is a 1796 British infantry officer's Spadroon. So this was the regulation infantry officer's sword from, officially from 1786, there was a slightly earlier model, 1786, all the way through to 1822. So this is the type of sword that majority of officers on foot used in the Napoleonic Wars, in not just the British Army, but there were equivalents in the French and Prussian and so on and so forth. But this is the British one, and this is a fairly nice one. It needs cleaning up, but it has, you hopefully will be able to see on camera, it has a blue and gilt blade, which means that the person spent more money on it. This is a private purchase thing. Have a look at that, Todd.
Right.
So the hilt is derived from a small sword, you can probably see.
Yeah. Very similar parallels with that.
Yeah.
Obviously you've got the wire binding here.
Yep.
Very simply done wire binding, in fact. So there's nothing complicated about that at all.
Shall I tell you a secret about this?
Yes.
That's a sheet.
Is it now?
It's an impressed sheet to look like wire.
Oh, now that you say it, yeah. Wow.
Really?
Yeah, you can see the line going, I think, down the front. Or maybe this is wire. No, it is, I think, because it's broken away a bit there. Oh.
How did they do that though? Okay, so, oh no, it is. You can see the end there. Yes. No, Matt is completely right. He's not lying to you. Wow, how cool is that? So, what? Yeah, I'm just not even going to translate on camera. You have an incredibly fine seam here, where you can't even see it in places, and it's just opening up. But you can see right at the end. I don't know if you can even get it on camera, just there you can see the end of the wire, and you can see it's not solid, it is sheet, very thin, maybe 0.2 mil thick, something like that. So yes, that would have been done in press tool. How they get that seam so nice, I have no idea. Anyway, that's another thing. Again, the hilt work would have been cast and then basically gone in with a little bit of chisel work and a little bit of stippling decoration and things like that to clean it up, to tighten up the details and things like that. So that process is really as old as time, in the sense of when the Romans and the Greeks were doing gloss wax casting, which they did. It's the same thing. You can get a bulk of
even Bronze Age.
Oh, really? So,
yeah.
So you can get the bulk of detail, and then yes, of course, actually Bronze Age. The bulk of detail, and then you go in with your little tools to fine it up and crisp it up. So that's all kind of very normal. Nothing particularly expensive about it. It's very tidily done, must be said. It's very nicely done. Loving that. That's not something I'm familiar with, actually.
Let me just show that at the camera. So this is what we call a drop, or a folding section to the side of the guard, and that's so that when you're wearing it, it doesn't make a mess of your uniform. And then when you draw it out, then you flip that down and you're ready to fight a Frenchman. There we go.
And the blade itself, yes, I mean, might have been rolled, might have been rough rolled and then cleaned up. Hard to say, really.
A lot of these blades were made in Solingen at this time. So although the various German states, because it's pre-unification, were at war with Napoleon, although some were allied with Napoleon at different points, Solingen was churning out huge numbers of blades and exporting them all over Europe. So a lot of German blades ended up in Britain.
I mean, I would guess, this is not my period at all in that sense, but I would guess because the end of the fuller here, or the hollow grind, is flat.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's much more likely that has been ground in
I think
than
so, yeah.
rolled in.
Yeah, yeah.
Because then I would expect that rolling to go through to the end of the blade.
Yeah.
But the blade itself, as so many blades are actually, it starts relatively thick and drops fairly quickly in the thickness. So drop to about here and then steady to about here and then starts to drop again. But yeah, I mean, it's just a very nice, very usable blade. But what you end up with, which is something that's quite stiff, not stiff enough really for stabbing, I'd say. I mean, you can, but it's not its primary function, obviously. It's more cutting. But you end up with something that's relatively stiff, but the whole thing is relatively light. So you can see that it does follow on from a lot of the concepts behind the small sword, really.
This will be about 700 or 800 grams.
Yeah. So everything about this sword has been done to lose weight out of it, really.
I should mention this particular model of sword has been described as the perfect encumbrance, and it was. Some people loved it, but you know, I've said a lot of mean things about spadroons on my channel, but they do have some things going for them. And if you see them, I think the positive way to see them is almost as a militarized small sword, in that you can use them like a small sword, but you've got a bit more beef to the blades, so you can parry bayonets, you can parry sabers with it. But in addition to that, you've also got some degree of cutting capacity.
I mean, I would say it doesn't look like it would either cut particularly well or thrust particularly well.
And there lies the criticism of spadroons, in that they're not as good at thrusting as a small sword and not as good at cutting as a saber.
One thing that kind of immediately sticks out to me is just, yeah, it feels somewhat like a small sword, but it doesn't have the ring. So
yeah,
I felt like immediately my finger was just looking for the ring, even though I know it's not there.
Where are you? Where are you?
And one thing I just find interesting about the folding guard. I mean, I guess there were some complaints about it because it can fail. Right?
And not all
this
of them
one
had
seems
that.
good.
Yeah, not all of them had that. Some of them had a fixed solid guard.
But you can see, you know, a hard blow on there and it's giving up in the first.
Sure.
Yeah, and
Yes.
also what I find interesting about that, this almost seems like the equivalent of having to practice to rack the slide when you draw a pistol. It's just this additional step that you have to drill into muscle memory. Otherwise, you might just, under stress, you might just be like, and you don't notice that you haven't done it. And
the only thing I would say is that officers were supposed to have their, if you were in action, your sword was supposed to be in your hand. Because primarily, at the time, this was used for pointing at things. So basically, the primary weapon use of this would be to say, "Men, attack over there," or "Get back in line." You know, this is primarily there for the officer to hold to show that they're an officer. So it should already be in their hand. But yeah, it is a valid point that if you were attacked suddenly and you pulled it out, you probably wouldn't bother folding that guard down. But then you'd still got the outside guard, so you've still got the primary.
It's not like it's a big deal, really, but it's just kind of interesting when you think
But if
about
you
that.
leave it folded up, you can put the thumb up on the inside and use it like a messer, like that. There we go.
No, I'm kind of liking it.
Yeah.
That's actually not even.
Yeah, it's actually really
kinda
comfortable.
like
Yeah.
that. Like unironically. Yeah, so thrusting, that's all right. Like, there are better swords for that purpose, and cutting, same thing. But at least it doesn't even look that bad. Like I've cut with some swords, like some Chinese swords in particular, that are not too dissimilar.
True. Some Jian are very, very narrow. Yeah. And one thing I would say about this is this particular example, many aren't, but this one has been service sharpened from about there upwards, which I find really, really interesting, because clearly they did not bother to put any edge on this part of the blade.
Seeing that, you can see that has never been sharpened.
Never, and you can see where the blue and gilt hasn't been messed with. But from about there upwards, they've actually applied the bevel. So much so that if you look along the edge this way, it can actually undulate. So it's been repeatedly sharpened, or shoddily sharpened, one or the other. But so they're really only looking to cut with this tip. So if they are cutting with it, they're literally, at the side of the head, at the sword hand, probably down at the lead leg, at the thigh. That's about it. Primarily, this is being used as a thrusting sword. And if we look at Anthony Gordon's treatise of 1805, for example, he does essentially use it like a small sword. So it's essentially a military, campaign smallsword. And also remember, most people, if you were carrying this, most enemies in hand-to-hand combat you might come up against are going to have a bayonet. Actually, they're not even going to have a sword. So you're not even going to be parrying cuts with it most of the time. You're going to be parrying thrusts, and actually having a bit more mass in the blade versus a small sword actually helps you deal with that big old musket being stabbed at you. So this is more a weapon of defense than offense. And I think from that point of view, it's actually not so bad, because it's fairly nimble, and you could probably parry bayonets okay with it, because it's fairly quick and it's stiff enough that it's going to do the job. But what do you think?
Yeah, in the video where I speculated about what might be the worst sort of history, or how you can approach that and all that,
Is that
what
there?
I said is...
Is that there?
Yeah, I mentioned it in the sense that it has that reputation, but when I think about it, if you compare this to, say, a Bronze Age sword, there are some that are not all that impressive. They're not as good in material quality, and design-wise, I mean, there's much simpler swords, and there's much less impressive swords in some ways. So how could this possibly be the worst?
No, I mean, I honestly would choose that
It's
over.
decent.
If my opponent had a Bronze Age leaf-bladed sword and no shield and no spear, and I had that, I would put my money on me, even if the other person was me as well.
Honestly, even a poorly made medieval arming sword, I might pick this over.
Yeah, it's quicker.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely very easy to use.
Quite good length. It's got quite good reach. It's made of quite good steel. It's springy steel.
It has at least a knuckle guard. Like, the hand is still exposed on the side, but it's still better. So it's not terrible. It's really
there you go. That's the news flash. Is Spadroons not that terrible?
No.
That's the selling point to Spadroons. Shall we move on to the next one? So we're going to move from one of the most maligned Napoleonic swords to one of the most beloved Napoleonic swords, at least according to modern people. There's a certain amount of mythology around this, but this is an officer's version of the 1796 light cavalry sabre. Steel scabbard, we'll put that aside for now. But that is an absolutely famous and iconic shape. I think there are certain shapes, I've always felt, in nature or in the world that we make, that everybody just agrees is a good looking shape. There are certain cars or certain horses or whatever that everyone goes, yeah, that's good looking. And I think most people think that 1796 is a good looking sword.
It's ugly, actually. No, just kidding.
So the first thing that I would say is the weight. It feels so light
compared to what it looks like.
Compared to what it looks like. It's still got quite a lot of blade presence in a sense, because you've got effectively no pommel.
The point of balance is quite far out.
But the bottom line is, without the pommel, I feel like it should be absolutely that. And the very clever, very aggressive hollow grinding, and it must be said thin. So at that point, it's maybe 2 millimeters.
Yes. So typical 1796 goes from about 8.5 millimeters at the base to about 2 millimeters up here.
Yeah, well, I'd say
massive distal taper.
It's thinner than that.
Yeah.
But again, the taper on this is really quite interesting, because you've got a reasonable drop to about here. Then it comes very steady, but there is a very visible step down here. So it goes from 4.5 millimeters to a little bit under 3, just in that little patch there.
And that is really typical of sabres of the 19th century. This non-linear, they've got a thick bit, a medium bit and a thin bit, and it sort of steps down like that. And that gives you the ability to have a sword that still hits with quite a lot of authority, can still be quite broad, but is actually quite light. So this will weigh about 800 grams. In fact, officers' versions, so the troopers' versions, which are the government produced and issued weapons, tend to be slightly more overbuilt for durability and economic reasons. They tend to be about 800 to 850 grams. The officers' versions are often lighter than that, let's say 700 to 850 grams. This is about, I think, about 750 to 800 grams.
But yeah, lovely piece. And I mean, you need very skilled cutlers to make this blade, or at least make the blade repeatedly. They can do one off and it'll be kind of about right. But when they're churning out 500 of them, Get that.
Yeah, most of these were made in Birmingham. So Birmingham was famous for making these swords and firearms at the time as well. But for anyone who doesn't know in the UK, you should know Birmingham was the heart of the arms industry in the 18th and 19th centuries. Really the powerhouse of gun and sword making.
Okay, LK Chin really did a good job. I reviewed their reproduction of this just recently, and feels pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Very, very similar.
So my view, I was slightly involved with the windlass reproduction, which, because I sold them an antique, which theirs is based on. My view is the blades are pretty much equivalent. I don't think LK Chen got the hilt shape exactly right.
It is a bit different, yeah.
But I think they got the shape of the grip a little bit too straight and things like this. But LK Chen makes a great blade, and in terms of weight and handling and everything else, I think they're both really good.
I'm not sure if I remember exactly how it looks. I feel like this stays a little bit thicker further up. I think
there is variation.
On the LK Chen, I think it starts to taper a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
I would have to compare them side by side.
So that is an officer's one, and officers' ones do tend to be a bit lighter, a little bit thinner.
Sense. Yeah.
But equally, at this time there were lots of different companies making these swords, so there's variation.
The other thing to remember, of course, is yes, it's mass production. Yes, they're made to a pattern on dies and all the rest of it. But they're ultimately, every single one of them is hand finished on whopping big wheels by a bloke who wants to go to the pub.
Yeah.
So there will always be differences.
And just 5 minutes more on the polish can subtly change the thickness the thickness of any part of the blade.
But I mean, absolutely, without question, made for cutting.
Oh yes, and so that is. We looked at something here that was an attempt to compromise between cut and thrust. That has just gone thrust out of the window, just throw everything at cut, the degree to the fact that the blade's slightly wider towards the tip, the fact that it's got this hatchet tip with the point located towards the back, the curvature, even the shape of the grip, the style of the grip as well. And a lot of people criticise this for a lack of hand protection, but you're not supposed to. This is a light cavalry sword. This is hit and run. So you ride past the enemy if they're on foot, you ride past and you're out the other side. You ride past other cavalry, it might be ding ding, and then you're out the other side at high speed. You never want to be in a static fight. Who do get into a static fight are heavy cavalry, and they have big handguards. So completely different type of sword for different purpose.
I could still see thrusts being used. I mean, it's not ideal, but you just have to angle it a little bit differently.
You can physically do it, and there's a funny thing. There was a French, so the French had a similarly curved sword, not as broad as this, and there is mention of them being held backwards to thrust with. Like that, because what that achieves is it means you can now hold it almost like a pistol grip and thrust that way. And there is a famous painting actually of a Napoleonic cavalry charge where most of the people are riding along like this, but the guy at the front is actually doing that. So you can, and because you've only got a simple knuckle bow there, you can quite easily flip it around. And one way that that downwards point could be useful is if you're on a horse and your opponent's on foot as well. So if you're riding past them, stabbing down like that with an inverted sword could work really quite well, and if they're trying to block with their musket, you can come up and over the top of it and then through and out as you go through. So they did use the points. It is pointy. Any pointy bit of metal can thrust. It's just not geared towards it. However, the next sword, we go back in the direction of compromise again. Tell me what you make of this. There we go.
Well, that blade looks like something that I'd make for Witcher.
It kind of does, yeah.
Yeah, there's. I've not seen one like that before, actually.
They're relatively rare.
It's sort of fantasy-ish for me.
Well, it's like a Messer or a Falchion, actually, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, heavier in the blade, which is interesting. I don't think it should feel much heavier in the blade, but it does for me. Yeah, I mean, just complicated fullering on there, twin fullers. Again, keep the stiffness up, lose the weight. I think for me it's the tip, which and a very, very slight sharpening on the false edge. But again, the reason that the sharpening can be slight is that the blade is so very, very thin.
Yes.
So again, just so we know, we're starting up at about 6mm, a little bit under here. Just steady, comes down, and then you get over this section here, a rapid drop down. So here it's nearly 4mm, here it's just a tiny bit over 2, I'd say. And by the time you get down here, it's like 1.5. You know, it's steel ruler thickness. It's,
So just to explain to viewers, if you don't know what this is, some of you will be shouting at the screen because you know exactly what this is. So this is the Regulation 1796 Light Cavalry Sabre. This was a particular attempt by one company, Osborne and Gunby. Osborne and Gunby, with criticisms that this wasn't very good at thrusting, came up with this. So this was their attempt to create a version of the 1796 which retained a very good cutting ability, but now had a point much more suited to thrusting, achieved partly by having a clipped point, a bit like a falchion, but also by having a straighter blade as well. But the hilt is essentially completely regulation. These come in officers and troopers versions. This is actually a troopers version. I've never owned an officers version. And it has a very basic hilt. In the modern collecting world, because I know some of you will ask, unfortunately these are quite rare, quite sought after, and therefore quite expensive. So within the same realms as the 17th century rapier. So at the moment this one's in my collection. It might be for sale one day. I've only had, I think, 3 in my whole collecting, maybe 4 in my whole collecting life, but they don't come around very often, unfortunately.
These are pretty common. We can go chop wood with it, right? No, I'm kidding. Interesting.
You can feel that's going to cut well, can't you? I mean,
yeah.
It's just there are some swords you just pick up and you just know. You don't even need to chop anything to know that they're going to cut well, so long as they're sharp.
It feels a lot like
Yeah.
that. In fact, I'm not sure if you handed them to me blindfolded. I'm not really sure I would be able to tell the difference just from the handling.
That's an interesting test we should do in a future video, the kind of Pepsi test with swords.
yes, what sword is this?
Do they taste different too? No, I don't want to know that. So
Lots of iron.
Yeah, it is more of a compromise, but I think I like it a little bit more.
Yeah.
Just because that extra bit of versatility, again, you can thrust with that, but a little bit better with this. And I can't really imagine that this cuts an awful lot less well than the more strongly curved.
But way better ability to use that point, especially if you're fighting on foot. Now I should say, is that important if you're fighting on horseback? And I think overall, people voted with their life choices, and this, although this is beloved by modern collectors, it didn't really catch on in period. A couple of yeomanry units bought them, I think. Some officers bought them because they thought that's really cool, but by and large most people stuck with the standard 1796. And even at the Battle of Waterloo, there are accounts of fights between British light cavalry and French cuirassiers and things like this, and where it's noted that the British were just hacking and cutting, but because the cuirassiers had breastplates and helmets, they said, well, you just aimed for the arms and the face. So they just knew if the person had armour, you just aimed a horizontal cut across the face or chop into their sword arm instead. But this was seen as successful enough, and also people's natural inclination, certainly British cavalry troopers of the time, and I would say from modern HEMA practice, modern British people as well, most people are more naturally inclined to just do this anyway, under stress. So if people are just naturally inclined to do that under stress, why not just give them something perfectly designed to do that? And having a more curved blade, if you're hitting a target and moving at speed, it's easier to draw the blade across or through or past the target. A straighter blade's more likely to stick on the target or jar your hand. But it's a beautiful sword, and for fighting on foot, I'd much rather have that than this.
Yes. For a duel, I think it would probably be better off with this. I mean, again, not a huge difference by any means, but yeah.
But what we're going to do now is we're going to jump forward from the beginning of the 19th century, so the early 1800s. We're going to jump forward towards the end of the 1900s and show a contrasting cavalry sword design, which I'm not sure if you've ever seen one of these on my channel before, but this is an Italian cavalry sword of the 1870s. Now, the Italians were quite advanced and innovative when it came to sword design in the late 19th century. They kind of lagged behind until it got to about the 1860s, and then it suddenly went into overdrive. And a lot of the designs of swords that came about in the 1880s and 1890s in other countries were inspired by movements happening in Italy, and this was also connected to the fencing movements, the fencing schools established in Italy, again in the 1870s particularly, and onwards, like Rodelli, for example. So here we've got an Italian cavalry sword. I think it's the 1873 model, and we'll dispense with the scabbard actually because we don't need that. You can see it's a completely different design to these earlier ones, but let's have a look and see what Todd makes of that. You'll see it's a much more industrial looking piece of machinery.
Well, the first thing to say is this part here is totally industrial. I mean, that could have been, I don't know, a breech block off a gun or something.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Which is very curious. For the thumb?
Yep.
Yeah. Not entirely comfortable, I would argue, though.
So if you put your hand further towards the back,
yeah,
there we go, and try and extend the thumb along the back.
Not convinced by that,
No.
actually.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. I don't know. Personally, I kind of like the security of having my hand up against the guard, but doing that, I get why it's there. It just doesn't.
Yep.
For me, no likey. The interesting that utter squareness, which you would think is horrible, doesn't interact with your hand in an unpleasant way.
Yes, because your hand's actually gripping this rounded bit down here, and only your thumb is along that bit. And
so you're resting on the flat, and that square corner is actually not rubbing against your hand at all. So you look at it and you think nasty, pick it up, that's great. Yeah, I mean, in a way, 1890s, 1870s, you say?
Yes, 1870s, but still being used in World War One.
Right. So it doesn't really belie modern manufacture techniques at all in that. There's nothing there that couldn't have been done in the medieval period, really.
No, absolutely.
Which is quite interesting. I'm guessing that's press work and then a little bit of welding fabrication.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
it is.
yeah, so it's a wooden grip, iron back piece, iron guard, probably equivalent to mild steel, and obviously that guard is very utilitarian. There's nothing ornate about it, so it has a rolled edge on the inner edge, so it's a little bit more forgiving to the uniform where it's bumping against.
Yeah, well, also it would add a little bit of strength as well.
Yep.
Whether that was part of the story or not, I don't know.
And then this type of guard, if I just hold that up to the camera for a second, this type of offset guard, so obviously they're trying to maximise the surface area of protection. There's a hole there to reduce the weight, but you've got a bold section, so it's quite resistant to outside impacts. But this guard is probably inspired. This was used in Italy and also places like Denmark. This guard is probably inspired by the works of Colonel Mary, a French cavalry guy based in North Africa, who did a book called A Memoir on Swords, which you can find on Google Books. And I think that these are inspired by Colonel Mary's designs. But anyway, quite an innovative style of guard that gives quite a lot of protection against both cuts and thrusts. And obviously if you're thrusting, your point would be down that way, and it gives full protection from that direction. And if you're parrying a cut, it would be that way, and a cut will lay across that hole there. So
yeah, I mean it's clearly an industrial made piece in a way. Well, I suppose in a way that the earlier Napoleonic era ones were as well, but just very different.
And what about the blade?
Well, that has been rolled.
Yep.
So that's quite interesting. So what you've got is a blade form that actually I haven't seen before, so I'm going to draw my pictures in the air. So you've got a blade, if that's the edge at the bottom, that comes up slightly like that, and then you've got a bead at the top, so that's what gives you the strength and the stiffness. And it's
so in the modern collecting world, this is known as a pipe back blade. In period, I've seen it described as a rod back blade and even a keyhole blade, because it's the shape of a keyhole.
It's a keyhole shape.
Yeah.
What advantage does that give over a fuller? I don't know. It might just be easier to manufacture at lower cost. I mean, obviously that's going to impinge on your ability to cut. And the other thing is about this that's notable is compared to the other sabres, the blade remains thicker for much longer. But then again, completely unlike the other sabres, is the blade thickens. So it's thinner here, probably nearly, well, 50% more again at the tip. So it reinforces the tip. So if it was against armour, I'd say that's exactly why they're doing it. But I'm guessing still you're going to have a bit of heavy cavalry about. But
I think if it didn't get thicker, the blade would be probably too thin at the tip and fragile because of the cross section of the blade. But I'm not sure if they necessarily thought about that as a reinforced tip rather than just only having the pipe back section for the cutting portion and then stopping the pipe back. I don't know.
It's a curious thing.
Yeah. And Sir Richard Francis Burton, one of the co-discoverers of Lake Victoria, the source of the Nile, and writer on many ethnographic issues, and also maker-upper of tall tales, I would say, he wrote quite favourably about Italian sword designs, including this pattern. So although he was British, well, he was raised in Switzerland, I think, but although he was a British officer, he was quite a fan of French and Italian fencing and swords, and thought that this was much better than the British swords of the period. Needless to say, I vehemently disagree, but that's a topic for another video. What do you think, Skall?
It's interesting when picking it up. The first thought was pretty light, and then the next thought, actually not so much.
So in literal terms, that's probably the heaviest of all these swords. And that's the weird thing, is that people think about swords as going out of use as we go later in the 19th century. But ironically, swords actually got heavier towards the end of the 19th century, partly to do with how they were being used, and they were being seen more like almost a lance, like a scab, a sheathable lance, and they weren't being used against other swords so much.
I mean, yeah, it's definitely the distal taper is pretty minor, and I think that's what causes it. It's just, it feels a little bit dead in the hand.
I agree.
The other ones are very lively, and you can easily. This is not heavy as such, so it's not a problem. It's just it does not feel as lively as the other ones.
I'll put it simply, it doesn't feel very nice.
No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. But it looks a lot sturdier, particularly when I look at this here.
Yes.
I wonder how often the tip broke off.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that was one of the points I wanted to mention. Is I think people have a perception that earlier period swords, especially things that look like that, must be more robust and stronger than swords that look like this. But actually it's the reverse. As we go later in the 19th century, pretty much universally, the construction of swords gets more beefed up and more rugged. So this is like, it's a bit like a rifle of the day, isn't it? It's like if you pick up a Lee Enfield or a Mauser or something like this. It feels mechanical and strong and rugged, and like you could go on campaign for 6 months with it and it'd be fine.
Yeah.
And even the scabbards. I mean, the scabbards are fairly sturdy piece of equipment.
All around too. The edge is. On a reproduction sword, I would criticize that, because that's terrible, actually.
It is.
Because
so it's a secondary bevel, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a strong secondary bevel, and it's really steep.
You know that's not going to cut well. You would struggle.
I wouldn't try.
And so that has been service sharpened. So that clearly has been taken on campaign. But you would struggle to get that through a tatami mat, wouldn't you?
Through a winter coat, you wouldn't.
I wouldn't want to be hit by it.
No.
But from a cavalryman, I mean, it would probably still send me to hospital. But it is not designed or sharpened by someone who understands how to make swords cut well.
No, I mean, but it does look like it is used in the lance form.
Absolutely, yeah.
I do find this space for the thumb here interesting, and it is kind of neat, because I find on a lot of swords, when you thrust with the thumb up there, what you often end up doing is, as the point encounters resistance, you just jam the tip of your thumb right up into the guard, which can be pretty unpleasant. I mean, it could still happen here, but you have a little bit more space. So if you hold on to it tightly, I don't think that would really happen as much.
Yeah,
So
it's interesting because the British went in the other direction. So whereas the Italians here have restricted the length of grip that you can actually fit your hand into, that pretty much means that if you want to put your thumb up, it has to go inside the guard. What the British did is instead you hold right down at the bottom so that your thumb has loads of space, and they lengthened the grip, has loads of space, so it won't ever conflict with that guard. They just increase the length of the grip and also fully checker the back here so that it's not going to slide as well. So a different way of doing things, but the Italians were very specific about this being smooth in order to give more fluidity to the hand on the grip. And even you'll notice the grip here is smooth wood, and again the Italians talk about that as being a really great thing, whereas you look at Britain, it's the complete polar opposite. We use shagreen, we use shark skin to give a really stable grip. So completely different approach to the same problem.
Yeah, and then like you pointed out, Toddy, the squareness here looks like it would be unpleasant, but it's not. Like just because of the way you hold it, like the thumbs up there, the rest, the fingers wrap around the rounded part, so it's not really a problem.
Your hand avoids the corners.
Yeah, exactly. So it looks blocky and sort of crude, but it works.
Brave designer who came up with that. Because, I mean, that's the sort of thing when you're looking for customers that's going to put people off. You know, can you imagine looking through a magazine advert of that and you'd go,
well, I think it's part and parcel of that Italy unified in, what was it, 1860, and then there was a rapid sense of advancement in Italy. It's like suddenly everything went into overdrive, and you see this in the fencing schools as well, and suddenly it's like, we are the best at fencing schools, we've got this new Rodelli method, everyone should do this is great, we're going to get new swords, we're not going to look at what anyone else is doing, we're just going to do our own designs, completely distinctive. It's like they suddenly got this great spurt of national confidence in their own ideas. I'm not saying that they were all good ideas, but you know, they did everything just a little bit differently. Even like how you cut, you know, if you look at Britain and France, the moulinet comes from the wrist, and the Italians start making it from the elbow. You know, they decide to just do everything their own way and very distinctive, and there are no other swords really in this period that look like Italian swords. They're very distinctive.
Okay, stupid and ahistorical, but you know what this thing really lends itself to?
Watch lag.
You can actually hold on to it pretty well.
Maybe that's what the pipe back's for. So, to finish up, which of these four swords that we've been through,
Immediately down.
which of these four swords would you
Not
choose?
this one.
I'm going to
I don't want that
complicate
one.
it because three of these are cavalry swords. So I'm going to say, let's assume that we are all excellent horsemen and we can ride well. Which of these three swords would you choose to go on campaign in a, let's say, the Crimean War, you know, 19th century war, where you might be fighting on horse, you might be fighting on foot? Which sword would you choose?
Should I be contrarian and pick the spadroon? No,
I don't. I think the spadroon's okay.
normally I would gravitate more toward this blade,
So that one.
but I'm honestly worried about breaking it off in someone, you know?
Okay.
Like, particularly from horseback. If you were to, like, the
Worried
idea was
about
that
the tip.
you're able, that you're better able to thrust, but it gets so thin there that, like, if you ride past someone and then the blade enters their body and gets lodged between bones, that's just gonna snap. That's what I would expect. Or, I mean, not necessarily, but it might.
Okay.
So I feel like I might be more confident with the 1796.
With the standard 1796.
Yeah.
Which I suspect might be your choice.
yeah, I love it. I mean, I'll be brutally honest and say it's more iconographic, really. I love the look of it.
Yeah.
I'm not swordsman enough to even be in the scenario just outlined. The one that I probably should take, because actually it looks tough. It looks tough
Yeah.
in a way that isn't, is that one. However, there is nothing about that I like.
Yeah. It's easily the strongest and most durable, but it's not very appealing.
See, the funny thing is, so the one thing that appeals to me about this is the hand protection, and the one thing that all of these swords really lack is decent hand protection. And if I were to fight in the way that I normally use a saber, so if I'm out here in terce, I'm going to have to, you know, even with the spadroon, I'm going to have to be constantly wary of my hand being sniped.
That's true.
Whereas with this one, I know I can stand out that they're pretty strong with this guard and rely on that pretty well. And it's got good length and reach. Okay, it's longer than the spadroon. It can probably thrust as well as the spadroon, and it's longer than the other two here. But the problem with this is it can't cut for toffee. And while you could
probably cut toffee, but it doesn't
yeah,
matter.
yeah. If you know, with an elbow moulinet from or mulinello from Rodelli, you could certainly hit something really, really hard with this. But I kind of feel like it's got such bad edge geometry that it's gonna wrap. It's gonna. It's just.
Clothing would just defeat it, other than the blunt impact.
Yeah,
you could crack skulls with it, but otherwise.
Yeah, so from a defensive point of view, this would be great. But from an offensive point of view, I'm going to be pretty much limited to using the point, and it doesn't have a very good point on it either.
No.
So I'm kind of in a quandary. I think I'll probably go with the Osborne and Gumby.
That's right, we don't have to fight over this.
That's the one I like the most out of these. But yeah.
So which did you choose in the end, Skall?
I did go with.
Right, so two of you chose the 1796.
Simply
there you
because
We do have to fight.
Yeah.
Oh no, we didn't. Did I say?
I mean,
Yeah, you definitely chose this one.
Yeah, I did.
the thing is, if it was a we're talking horseback, right? If it was a duel, I could be persuaded to go with the spadroon. Actually, unironically,
Yeah.
it's not bad. I don't mind it at all.
So they've all got different strengths and weaknesses, but there we go on that bombshell. Thanks a lot, Skall. Thanks, Todd.
Pleasure.
Which sword would you have chosen? Do you think we're all totally wrong? Get posting in the comments down below, and hopefully I'll see you back on the channel soon. And also watch out for content on Skall and Todd's channels as well, featuring us. Cheers, folks.